It had been a beautiful car. He remembered Mark's casual prediction that it wouldn't be worth a damn to him, and Mark had been wrong. Some of it was useful. Lunch was fish with half a lime, orange juice, all you could drink, a square of honeycomb. Dan and Helen were at the table, and the others had already finished. Helen always waited for him, Randy noticed, and she was so solicitous it was sometimes embarrassing. Dan looked at his plate and said, "A fine thinning diet. If everybody in the country had been on this diet before the day, the cardiac death rate would have been cut in half." "So what good would it have done then?" Randy said. He speared his honey and munched it, rolling his eyes. "We've got to do more trading with Jim Hickey. We've got to find something Jim needs." Randy remembered what Jim had said about half his broods going foul since the day, and how Jim suspected radiation was responsible. He told Dan and Helen what Hickey had said. Dan stared at his plate, troubled. He cut into his honeycomb and tasted it. "Delicious," he said. But his mind was elsewhere. At last he looked up and spoke gravely. "We shouldn't be surprised. Who can tell how much cesium-137 showered down on the day? How much was carried into the upper atmosphere and had been filtered down since? The geneticists warned us of damage to future generations. Well, Hickey's bees are future generations." Helen looked scared, and Randy realized that this was a more serious matter to women than to men. Although frightening enough to anybody, she said, "Does that mean, will it affect humans?" "Certainly some human genetic damage can be expected," Dan said. "What will happen to the birth rate is anybody's guess, and yet this is only nature's way of protecting the race. Nature is proving Darwin's law of natural selection. The defective bee, unable to cope with its environment, is rejected by nature before birth. And I think this will be true of man. It is said that nature is cruel. I don't think so. Nature is just and even merciful. By natural selection, nature will attempt to undo what man has done." "You make it sound comforting," Helen said. "Only an opinion based on almost no evidence. In 6 or 7 months, I'll know more. But to evaluate everything may take 1,000 years. So let's not worry about it right now. I've got other worries, like tires. The tires on the Model A are smooth. Randy and I've got to make a couple calls out in the country. Sorry, Randy, I've got to make a couple of calls out in the country. Got any suggestions?" "I've been thinking of tires," Randy said. "The tires on Florence's old Chevy will fit the Model A. 2 of them are almost new. Let's go over and make the change." It was the custom of Randy and Dan to meet in the apartment at 6 each evening, listening for the Clear Channel station, which would be heard at this hour, if at all. If they were tired and the rigors of the day warranted, share a drink. At 6 that Friday evening, Dan had not returned from his calls. So Randy sat at his bar alone with the little transistor portable. Life was ebbing from its last set of batteries, and he feared the day when he would no longer pick up even the strongest signal, or give any sound whatsoever, and the day could not be far distant. So, what strength was left in the batteries he carefully rationed. Sam Hazard's all-wave receiver, operating on recharged automobile batteries, was really their only reliable source of information. He clicked on the radio and was relieved to hear static, and tried the Conelrad frequencies. Immediately he heard a familiar voice, thin and gravelly, and he turned the volume full. Against smallpox. Randy knew he had missed the first item of the news. Then he heard, "There have been isolated reports of disorders and outlawry from several of the contaminated zones. As a result, Mrs. Van Brooker Brown, acting president in her capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, has authorized all reserve officers and National Guard officers not in contact with their commanders or headquarters to take independent action to preserve public safety in those areas where civil defense has broken down or where organized military units do not exist. These officers will act in accordance with their best judgment under the proclamation of martial law. When possible, they will wear the uniform when exercising authority. I repeat this new... The signal hummed and faded. Randy clicked off the set. Even as he began to assimilate the significance of what he had heard, he was aware that Helen was standing on the other side of the counter. In her hand, she held a pair of scissors, comb, and a silver hand mirror. She was smiling. "Did you hear that?" he said, before I continue. So, when Mrs. Van Brooker Brown announces that anybody who is a part of any branch of the armed services, whether they are retired or in the National Guard, and gives them permission to basically keep the peace, you will see that now Randy is able to, with real authority, act as a leader in Fort Repose. He had already been acting as a leader, but now he has the legal authority to do so. Okay? Yes, today's your haircut day, Randy. Today's Friday. Helen trimmed his hair and Bill McGovern's fringe each Friday, and barbered Dan and Ben Franklin Saturdays. "You know I'm in the reserve," Randy said. "I'm legal." "What do you mean?" "I had to pull my gun this morning to get Porky Logan buried, and I had no authority. But now I do have authority, legally." His thoughts on the proclamation at the moment went no further. "That's fine. Now get into a chair." He walked into his office. Because of the swivel chair, it was also the barber shop. Helen tied a towel around his neck and began snipping deftly and rapidly. She was some woman, he thought. Under any conditions, she could keep a household running smoothly. In 10 minutes, it was done. Her hand ruffled and then smoothed his hair, and he could feel her breasts, round and warm, pressing against his shoulder blades. "You're getting gray hairs, Randy," she said. The timbre of her voice was deeper than usual. "Who isn't?" She rubbed and smoothed his temples. Her fingers kneaded the back of his neck. "Do you like that?" she whispered. Mark loved it. When he came home, tense and worried, I always rubbed his temples and his neck like this. And Randy said, "Feels fine." He wished she wouldn't talk like that. She made him nervous. He put his hands on the arms of the chair and turned to rise, and she pulled him back, whirled the chair around so that he faced her, and her eyes were round, and he could see beads of perspiration at the corners of her nose and on her forehead. "You're Mark," she said. "Don't you believe me? Here, look." She lifted the mirror from the desk and thrust it before his face, and he looked, wondering how he could gracefully escape, wondering what was wrong with her. It was true that his face was leaner and harder, and looked like Mark's face now. "I do look something like him," he admitted, "but why shouldn't I? I'm his brother." Her arms pinned him with unexpected strength, and she kissed him wildly, as if her mouth could subdue and mold and change him. His hands found her wrist, and he forced her back. The mirror fell and smashed. "Don't!" she cried. "Don't push me away. You're Mark. You can't deny you're Mark." He struggled out of the chair, clamping her wrist, trying not to injure her. And he knew that she was mad, and he fought to control the panic within him. "Stop it," he heard himself shouting. "Stop it, Helen, stop it. I'm not Mark, I'm Randy." And she screamed, "Mark!" The door was ajar. Through it came Lib's voice, loud and welcome. "Randy, are you shorn? If Helen's finished, come on out. I've got something to show you." He released Helen's wrists. She leaned against the desk, face averted, shoulders quivering, one hand stifling the sounds erupting from her mouth. And he said gently, "Please, Helen." And he touched her arm, and she drew away from him, and he fled into the living room. Lib stood at the porch door, her face somber, beckoning him. She said quietly, up to the roof where we can talk." Randy followed her, knowing that she must have heard and had been grateful for her interference. It was something he would have to tell Lib anyway. He would have to tell Dan too. This emotional earthquake could bring down their house, and it was a problem for a physician. Up on the captain's walk, Randy lowered himself carefully into a deck chair. The canvas would rot before the summer's end, and his hands were shaking. "Did you hear it all?" he asked. "Yes, all, and saw some too. Don't ever let her know." "What's wrong with her?" It was a protest rather than a question. Lib sat on the edge of his chair and put her hands on his hands and said, "Stop shaking, Randy. I know that you're confused, but it was inevitable. I knew it was coming. I'll diagnose it for you as best I can. It's a form of fantasy." Randy was silent, wondering at her detachment and coolness. "It is," she went on, "the sort of transference you find in dreams, the substitution in dreams of one person for another. Helen allowed herself to slip into a dream, and I think she is a completely chaste person. She is, isn't she? I'm sure of it, or I was. Yep, she is a person who requires love and is used to it. For many years, a man has been the greater part of her life. She has had this conflict, intense loyalty to her husband, and yet need of a man to receive her abundance of love and affection. She tried to resolve the conflict irrationally. You became Mark. It was a hallucination." "You're talking like a professional, Lib." "I'm not a professional. I just wanted to become one. I majored in psychology, remember?" It was something that she had told him, but that he had forgotten because it seemed incongruous and not in the least important. Lib looked like a girl who had majored in ballet and water skiing at Miami rather than psychology at Sarah Lawrence. He knew that she had worked for a year in a Cleveland clinic and had abandoned the job only because of her mother's illness. When she spoke of this year, which was seldom, it was with nostalgia, as some girls spoke of a year in Europe or on the stage. He suspected it must have been the most rewarding year of her life, and certainly there must have been a man or men in it. Randy said, "Lib, do you think she's crazy?" "Helen's not psychotic. She's just under terrible strain. She let herself go only for a moment. She indulged a temporary fantasy, and now it's over. And now she will be ashamed of herself. The best thing you can do is pretend it didn't happen. One day she'll mention it to you, perhaps obliquely, and apologize. And eventually she'll understand why she did it, and the sense of guilt will leave her. One day, when we're better friends, I'll make her understand it. You know, there is a man in the house for Helen, a perfectly fine man, and I'm going to make that my special project." Randy felt relieved. He looked out over the river, contemplating his ignorance of women and the peace of evening. On the end of the dock, Ben Franklin and Peyton were fishing. It was understood that anyone, child or adult, could go fishing before breakfast or after assigned chores were done. Fishing was not only recreation, but the necessary daily harvest of a crop, providentially swimming at their feet. Presently, the brass ship's bell on the porch rang its sharp, clear C note. The bell was a relic of Lieutenant Randolph Rousey Peyton's longboats. It was the same bell that Randy's mother had used to summon Mark and him from the river to wash for dinner. There was peace and continuity in the sound of the bell. The bell was there. The bell announced that there was food on the table and women in the kitchen. So it was not only a message to the children, but to Randy. Helen had pulled herself together. He watched Ben and Peyton, trailed by Graff, thread their way up through the grove. Graff still shared Randy's couch, but all day he shadowed the boy. And this was right. A boy needed a dog. A boy also needed a father. When the children were close to the house, Randy yelled down, "What'd you get?" And Ben held up a string of brim and speckled perch. 16, he shouted, on worms and crickets. I got 15. She only got 1. Peyton danced in indignation, a slim, shrill-voiced sprite. Who cares about fish? If I grow up, I'm not going to be a fisherman. Helen called from the kitchen window and the children disappeared. And Randy said, "Did you ever hear a little girl say, 'If I grow up,' before?" "No, I never did, and it gives me the creeps." "Not their fault," Randy said. "Ours." "Would you want children, Randy?" Randy considered the question, and he thought of Jim Hickey's bees and Peyton's if, and of cow's milk that you did not dare feed a baby in a contaminated zone, even if you had a cow, and of many other things. Lib waited a long time for an answer, and then she leaned across the chair and kissed him and said, "Don't try to answer now. I've got to go down and help with dinner. Don't come downstairs for a few minutes, Randy. We've whipped up a surprise." At 7, conscious that he had not heard Dan return, Randy went downstairs. The table was set as if for a feast, a white cloth, 2 new candles, a salad bowl as well as a plate at each place, and a laden salad boat of Haitian mahogany rode on the circular linen lagoon. Garnishing the inevitable platter of broiled fish was a necklace of mushrooms. He tasted the salad. It was delicate, varied, and wonderful. "Who invented this?" he asked. He had not tasted greens in months. Helen had not met his eye since he had entered the room. She said, "Alice Cooksey." Alice found a book listing edible palms, grasses, and herbs, and Lib did most of the picking. "What's all in it?" "Fiddlehead ferns, hearts of palm, bamboo shoots, wild onions, some of the Admiral's ornamental peppers, and the first tomatoes out of Hannah Henry's garden." Lib said, "Wait till you try the mushrooms." That was Helen's idea. "It's funny, for the last week they've been growing all over right in front of our eyes, and only Helen recognized them as food." "No toadstools, I hope," Randy said. Helen smiled, and for the first time looked at him directly. "Oh no, Alice thought of that too. I've been wandering around the hammock with an illustrated book in one hand and a basket in the other. And now she could see he was treating the incident in his office as something that hadn't happened, and she was regaining control of herself. And he said, "Helen, you be careful in that hammock, and Lib, you stay out of palm trees. We don't want any snake bites or broken legs. Dan has enough troubles." He put down his fork. "Where's Dan?" Nobody knew. Dan was usually home before 6. Occasionally he was as late as this or later when he encountered an emergency. Still, it was impossible not to worry. It was at times like this that Randy truly missed the telephone. Without communication, the simplest mechanical failure could turn into a nightmare and disaster. He finished the fish, mushrooms, and salad, but without appetite. Randy fidgeted until 8 and then said, "I'm going to go see the Admiral. Maybe Dan stopped there for dinner." He knew this was unlikely, but he tried in any case to visit Sam Hazard each evening and watch him comb the frequencies. There were other reasons. He stopped at the Weecheck and Henry houses like a company commander checking his outposts. He slept uneasily unless he knew all was well around his perimeter. More compelling, Lib usually went with him, and it was their opportunity to have a little time alone. It was paradoxical that they lived in the same house, ate almost every meal elbow to elbow or across the bar in his apartment, and slept within 20 feet of each other, and yet they could hardly be alone. Ben Franklin said, Wait until I get the shotgun, Randy. I'll go with you. It's my night to stand guard," and he raced upstairs. Helen said, "Do you really think you ought to let him do it, Randy?" "It'd break his heart if I didn't. I think he'll be okay. Caleb is going to stay up with him, and Malachi will be right there." "Malachi will sleep with one eye open." "Why are you letting him have your shotgun?" "Because if anything comes around the Henry's yard, I want him to hit it. not just pop away at it in the dark with a .22. I've taught him how to handle the shotty, and it'll be loaded with number 2 buck. He'll do all right. And Ben came out on the porch carrying the gun, and Lib said, "Am I invited?" Randy said, "Certainly," and he turned to Bill McGovern. "If Dan shows up, give me 3 bells, will you?" 3 strokes of the ship's bell meant come home, but it was not an emergency signal. 5 bells was the panic button, and the bell could be heard for a mile along the shore and across the water. Pale yellow lamplight showed in the Henry's windows. Randy knocked, and Missouri, looking almost svelte in a newly acquired waistline, opened the door. "Mr. Randy, I guess 'twas you. I want to thank you for the honey, and it tasted mighty good. Will you come in and have some tea?" "Tea?" Randy saw a kettle steaming on a brick oven in the fireplace. "We calls it tea. I grow mint under the house and dry 'em until they powders, so we have mint tea. We'll skip it tonight, Mizzou. I just came to put Ben Franklin on his stand. Caleb ready?" Missouri's son stepped out of the shadows, teeth and eyes gleaming. Incredibly, he carried a 6-foot spear. "Let me see that," Randy said, and he hefted it. It had been fashioned, he saw, from a broken garden edger. The blade ground to a narrow triangle. It was heavy, well-balanced, and lethal. "Uncle Malachi made it for me," Caleb said proudly. "It's a wicked weapon, all right," Randy said, and returned it to the boy. Malachi, carrying a lantern, joined them. Malachi said, "I figured that if Ben Franklin missed with the shotgun, Caleb best have it for close-in defense, if it truly is a wolf like Preacher says." Randy was certain that whatever had stolen the Henry's hens and the pig, it wasn't a wolf, but he wanted to impress Ben Franklin with the seriousness of his watch. "Probably not a wolf," he said, "but it could be a cougar or a panther. My father used to hunt 'em when he was young. Plenty of panther in Timucuan County until the first boom brought so many people down, and now there aren't so many people. So there may be more panther." They walked toward Balaam's tired barn, and the mule snorted and rattled the boards in his stall. "It's only me, Balaam," Malachi said. "Balaam, quiet down." And Balaam quieted. Randy pointed to the bench alongside the barn. "That's your stand, Ben." Bill McGovern had sat on the bench the previous night and had seen nothing. "Stand?" Ben said. "That's what you call it in a deer hunt. When I was your age, my father used to take me hunting and put me on a stand. There are a couple of things I want you to remember, Ben. Everything depends on you, and you, Caleb, keeping absolutely still. Whatever it is out there is better equipped than you are. It can see better and hear better and smell better. All you've got on it is brains. Your only chance of getting it is to hear it before it hears or sees you." Randy looked at the sky. There were only stars. Later, there would be a quarter moon. "Chances are you'll hear it before you see it. But if you talk or make any sound, you'll never see it at all, because it'll hear you first and leave. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Ben said. "You'll get cramped and you'll get tired, so when you sit on the stand, you move around all you want at first and find out just how far you can move without making any noise. You've got the shells in the chambers?" "Yes, sir, and 4 extra in my pocket." "You'll only need what's in the gun if you don't get him. With 2, you'll never get him at all. And Ben?" "Yes, sir." "Hold steady and don't miss. We want to get rid of this thing, or somebody will have to sit up every night." Ben said, "Randy, suppose it's a man." This possibility had been restless in Randy's mind from the first, and he had not wanted to mention it, but since it was mentioned, he gave the unavoidable answer. "Whatever it is, Ben, shoot it. And Caleb, if he misses, I depend on you to stick it." And he turned to Malachi. "Thank you for lighting us out. We're going on to Admiral Hazard's house now. Good night, Malachi." "Good night," Malachi said. "I sleep late, Mr. Randy." Lib took his hand, and they walked to the river bank and down the path that led toward the single square of light announcing that Sam Hazard was in his den. Randy chuckled, thinking of Caleb's spear. "We have just witnessed a historic event," he said. "What do you mean?" North American civilization's return to the Neolithic age. "I don't think it's funny," Lib said. "I don't like the way you spoke to Ben Franklin. It was brutal." "In the Neolithic," Randy said, "a boy either grows up fast or he doesn't grow up at all." Sam Hazard's den was compact and crowded, like a shipmaster's cabin stocked for a long and lonely voyage. It was filled with mementos of his service, ceremonial and samurai swords, nautical instruments, charts, maps, books on shelves and stacked in corners, bound files of the proceedings, the Foreign Affairs Quarterly, and the annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. The Admiral's L-shaped desk spread along two walls. One side was preempted by the professional-looking shortwave receiver and his radio log. The radio was turned on, but when Randy and Lib entered the room, all they heard was a low hum. Sam Hazard was not as tall as Lib, and his weathered skin was drawn tautly over his fine bones. In slippers and dragon-blazoned shantung robe, his implacable gray eyes shadowed and softened by the indistinct lighting and horn-rimmed glasses, cottony hair like a halo. He appeared fragile, a deception. He was tough as an antique ivory figurine which had withstood the vicissitudes of centuries and can accept more. He said, "A place for the lady to sit," and he sailed a plastic model of the carrier Wasp, the old Wasp cited by Churchill for stinging twice in the Mediterranean, and then herself stung to death by torpedoes, to the far corner of the desk. "Up there," he ordered Lib, "where you can be properly admired. And you, Randy, lift those books out of that chair. Gently, if you please. Welcome aboard to both of you." Randy said, "You haven't seen Dan Gunn, have you?" "No, not today." "Why?" "He hasn't come home." "Missing, eh? That sounds ungood, Randy." "If he comes home while we're out, Helen or Bill will ring the bell. So can we hear it here?" "Yes, indeed, as long as the window's open. It always startles me." Randy saw that the Admiral had been working. The Admiral was writing something that he had called, without elaboration, a footnote to history. A portable typewriter squatted in the center of a ring of books. Research, Randy supposed. He recognized Durant's Caesar and Christ, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, and von Krieg by Clausewitz, indicating a footnote to ancient history. Randy said, "Any poop this evening?" "I suppose you heard the Civil Defense broadcast. I caught part of it, and then my batteries quietly expired." The Admiral gave his attention to the radio. He turned the knob, changing frequencies. "I've been listening for a station in the 31-meter band. Claims to be in Peru. I heard it for the first time last night, and it put out some pretty outlandish stuff. It doesn't seem to be on yet, so we'll try for it later. I've just switched to 5.7 megacycles, and that's an Air Force radio frequency that I can tap sometimes. You've never heard it, Randy. Interesting but cryptic." The speaker squealed and whined. "Somebody's transmitter is open," the Admiral interpreted. "Something's coming." A voice boomed with shocking loudness in the small room. Sky Queen, do not answer, do not answer. This is Big Rock, Applejack, repeat, Applejack, authentication, X-ray." Lib spoke excitedly. "What is that? What does it mean?" Hazard smiled. "I don't know. I'm not up on Air Force codes and jargon. I've heard that Sky Queen call 2 or 3 times in the past month. Sky Queen could be a bomber, or a patrol plane, or a wing, or air division. Big Rock, whoever that is, could be telling Sky Queen, whatever she may be, any number of things. Proceed to target, orbit, continue patrol, come home, all is forgiven. I can't even make an informed guess. However, I do know this. That was a good American call and we're still in business. The smile departed. On the other hand, it indicates that the enemy is still in business too. How do you figure? Randy asked. That do not answer phrase? Why does Big Rock order Sky Queen to be silent? Because if Sky Queen acknowledges the call, then somebody might be able to take a radio fix on her, estimate speed and course and vector fighters, or launch ground-to-air rockets to shoot her down. Randy considered this. Then Sky Queen is probably stooging around over enemy territory. That's a good deduction, but we can't be certain. For all we know, Sky Queen may be hunting a sub off Daytona. It makes me wild listening to the damn Air Force. You will please pardon me, Lib. But if the enemy is listening on this frequency, it must make them wild too. Lib asked, what did that authentication X-ray stand for? X-ray is simply international code for the letter X. My guess is that before every mission, they changed the authentication letter so that the enemy can't take over the frequency and give Sky Queen a false heading or phony instruction. You know, I enjoyed hearing that, Lib said. It gave me a nice feeling. Big Rock has a solid Midwest accent. Sam Hazard moved a candle so that better light fell on his dish. Big Rock won't be back again tonight, he said. I've never heard him more than once a night. He makes his call, and that's it. I'll try the 31-meter band again. And in the candlelight, Hazard's hands shone with the silky, translucent patina of age, and yet they were remarkably deft. They discovered a fascinating squeal. His fingers worked the band spreader delicately as a master cracksman, violating a safe, and he pressed his face forward as if he expected to hear tumblers click. Very gradually, a faint voice replaced the squeal, and he turned up the power. They heard, in English, with an indefinite accent. Continuing the news to North America, the representative of the Argentine has informed the South American Federation that 2 ships with wheat have sailed for Nice in southern France, responding to radio appeals from that city. The appeals from Nice say that several 100,000 refugees are camped in makeshift shelter on the Côte d'Azur. Many are starving. The casino at Monaco and the Prince's Palace have been converted into hospitals. In a Spanish-language broadcast heard here today, Radio Tokyo announced that the Big Three meeting in New Delhi has approved preliminary plans for flying desperately needed vaccines and antitoxins to uncontaminated cities in Europe, North America, and Australia. Big Three, Randy said. Who's the Big Three? Shh, said the Admiral. Maybe we'll find out. The announcer continued. China, where the Save Asia First sentiment is strong, urged that the first priority for vaccine aerial shipments go to the Soviet Union's maritime provinces, where typhus is reported. India and Japan felt that the smallpox epidemic on the west coast of the United States, Canada, and Mexico should receive equal priority. The universal shortage of aviation gasoline will make any quick aid difficult, however. And the squeal insinuated itself into the voice and subdued it. Hazard caressed the band speaker. The atmospherics have been crazy ever since the day. Abruptly, he said to Randy, "Do you believe it?" "It's weird," Randy said. "Maybe it's Soviet bloc propaganda stations pretending to be South American, set up to confuse us and start rumors. I'll admit, I'm confused. I thought the Chinese were in it, on the other side." "The Chinese never liked Russia's preoccupations with the Med," Hazard said. "Maybe they opted out, which would be smart of them. It could be simpler. If they didn't have nuclear capability, we wouldn't bother hitting them on the day. And without nuclear weapons, they wouldn't dare stick their noses into a real war. If that was it, they were lucky." "I noticed that the station quoted Tokyo. How is it you didn't hear Tokyo?" I have never been able to pick up any Asiatic stations. I used to get Europe fine, London, Moscow, Bern, Africa too, especially the Voice of the America transmitter in the Tangier. Not anymore, not since the day. The signal cleared, they heard. But as yet, the Big Three have been unable to reopen communications with Dmitry Torgats. According to Radio Tokyo, Torgats headed the Soviet government while the Soviet Union's capital was in Ulaanbaatar in Outer Mongolia. The medium wave station in operation from Ulaanbaatar is no longer heard. That doesn't sound like Soviet propaganda to me, Randy said. Who's Dmitry Torgats? The Admiral glanced up at a shelf of reference works, and he selected a slender book, Directory of Communist Leaders, and found the name and read Torgats, Dmitry, born Leningrad, 1903. Married, wife's name unlisted, children unlisted, director of Leningrad Anti-Prop 1946 to 49, candidate, member, Presidium 1950 to 53, director, Waterworks, Naryanmar, Siberia, since fall of Malenkov. Looks like they had a shakeup, Randy said. Looks like they had to reach way down and find a minor league bureaucrat. Yes, it's surprising that Torgats should be running Russia, the Admiral said, unless you consider that a female, last on the list of cabinet members, is running the United States. Randy could see that Lib wasn't listening. She was staring at the tassel of a sword resting on pegs behind his head, her lips parted, eyes unblinking. Her thoughts, he had discovered, frequently raced ahead of his or sped down dark and fascinating byways. When she concentrated, thus she left the party. She murmured, smallpox. Not understanding that Lib mentally was no longer in the room with them, Sam Hazard inquired, what about smallpox? Oh, Lib shook her head. I think of smallpox as something out of the Middle Ages, like the Black Plague. It's true that every so often it cropped up, but we always slapped it down again. What happens now without vaccine? What about diphtheria and yellow fever? Will they start up again? Without penicillin and DDT, where are we? All good things came to us automatically, and we were born with silver spoons in our mouths and electric dishwashers to keep them sanitary and clean. We relaxed, didn't we? What happened to us, Admiral? Sam Hazard disconnected the radio's batteries and pulled his chair around to face them. I've been trying to find the answer. He nodded at the typewriter and books massed on his desks. I've been trying to put it down in black and white and pass it along, and up to now, no bottom. All I found out was where I myself and my fellow professionals failed, and I'll explain. He opened a drawer and drew out a folder. I called this a footnote to history, you see. I was in the Pentagon when we were having the big hassles on roles and missions, and it occurred to me that I might be one of the few still alive who knew the inside of what went on and how the decisions were reached, and I thought the future historians might be interested. So I set it all down factually. I set down all the arguments between the big carrier admirals, and the atomic seaplane admirals, and the ICBM generals, and the Pentomic Division generals, and the heavy bomber generals, and the manned missile generals. I told how we finally achieved what we thought was a balanced establishment. And when I finished, I read it over and realized it was a farce. He tossed the manuscript on the desk as if he were discarding unwanted fourth-class mail. You see, I confused the tactical with the strategic. I think we all did. The truth is, once both sides had maximum capability in hydrogen weapons and efficient means of delivering them, there was no alternative to peace. Every maxim of war was archaic. The rules of Clausewitz, Mahan, all of them were obsolete as the Code Duello. War, no longer an instrument of national policy, only an instrument for national suicide. War itself was obsolete. So, my footnote deals with tactical palavers of no real importance. We might as well have been playing on the rug with lead soldiers. The Admiral rose and unkinked his back. I think most of us sensed this truth, but we could not accept it. You see, no matter how well we understood the truth, it was necessary that the Kremlin understand it too. It takes two to make a peace, but only one to make a war. So, all we can do, while vowing not to strike first, was to line up our lead soldiers. That was all you could do, Lib asked. The answer was not in the Pentagon or even in the White House. I'm looking elsewhere. One place here, he tapped. Gibbon. There are odd similarities between the end of the Pax Romana and the end of the Pax Americana, which inherited Pax Britannica. For instance, the price is paid for high office when it becomes common to spend $1 million to elect senators from moderately populous states. I think that should have been a warning to us. For instance, free pap for the masses, bread and circuses, Roman spectacles, and our spectaculars, largesse from the conquering proconsuls, and television giveaways from the successful lipstick king. To understand the present, you must know the past, yet it is only a part of the answer, and I will never discover it all. I have not the years. Randy saw that the Admiral was tired. I guess we better get going, he said. Thanks for an entertaining evening. Next time you come over, Hazard said, I want you to look at my invention. Are you inventing something too? Everybody's inventing something. Yes, it's called a sailboat. It's a means of propulsion that replaces the gasoline kicker. I sacrificed my flagpole and patio awning to make it. The cutting and sewing was done by Florence Weechek in Missouri and Hannah Henry, and I can now recommend them as experienced sailmakers. Thanks, Sam, Randy grinned. That's a wonderful invention and will become popular. I know I'm going to get one right away, and I will use your firm of sailmakers. They walked to the path along the river bank, swinging at its buoy. Randy saw the Admiral's compact little cruiser with covered foredeck, useless kicker removed, and a slender mast acing its tip and a multitude of stars. There were many sailboats on Florida's lakes, but Randy had seen very few in the upper reaches of the St. Johns or on the Timaquan. I love the Admiral, Lib said, and I worry about him. I wonder whether he gets enough to eat. The Henry C. that he eats, and Missouri keeps his place neat, and the Henrys love him too. As long as we have men like that, I can't believe we're so decadent that we won't go like Rome, will we? He didn't answer. He swung her around to face him and circled her waist with his hands. His fingers almost met. She was so slim, and he said, I love you, and I worry about you. I wonder whether I tell you enough how much I love you, and want you, and need you, and how I am diminished and afraid when you're not with me, and how I am multiplied when you are here. His arms went around her, and he felt her body arch to him, molding itself against him. There never seems to be enough time, he said, but tonight there's time when we get home. She said, yes, Randy. They walked on, his arm around her waist. This is a bad time for love, she said. Oh, I don't mean tonight is a bad time. I mean just the times. When you love someone, that should be what you think of most, the first thing when you wake in the morning and the last thing before you go to sleep at night. And before the day, that's how I thought of you. Did you know that? First in the morning and last at night? Randy knew, without her saying it, that it must be the same, as it was for him. At day's end, a man was exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally. Each sun heralded a new crisis, and each night he bedded with old, relentless fears. He awoke thinking of food and fell onto his couch, at night still hungry. his head whirling with problems unsolved and dangers unparried. The Germans, in their years of methodical madness, had discovered, in their concentration camp, that when a man's diet fell below 1,500 calories, his desire and capacity for all emotions dwindled. Randy guessed that he had managed to consume almost 1,500 calories each day in fish and fruit alone, and his vigor was being expended in survival, he decided. That and worry for the lives dependent upon him. Even now, he could not exclude worry for Dan Gunn from his mind. The hodgepodge outlines of the Henry's place loomed out of the darkness above them. They were within 50 yards of the barn, and Ben Franklin was somewhere in that shadow, shotgun over his knees, enjoined to silence, alert to shoot anything that moved. And they were moving, silhouetted against the star-silvered river. He stopped and held Lib fast. "Ben," he called. "Ben Franklin. Do not answer. Do not answer. This is Randy. We're on our way home." And then walked on. "You know, you sounded just like that radio call on the Air Force frequency," Lib said. "I did sound like that, didn't I?" He smiled in the darkness, snapped his fingers, and said, "I think I know now what was going on. It wasn't the way Sam thought. It was the other way around. Big Rock was the plane, and Sky Queen the base. Big Rock had been somewhere and was coming home and was telling Sky Queen not to shoot, just like I told Ben Franklin. Perhaps you're right. Not that it matters to us. I've heard them up there on still nights, but they never come low enough to see. The Admiral hears them talk on the radio, but they never have a word for us. Maybe they've forgotten us. Maybe they've forgotten all the contaminated zones. We're unclean, and it makes me feel lonely and, well, unwanted. Isn't that silly? Does it make you feel like that?" "They'll come back," he said. "They have to. We are still a part of the United States, aren't we?" They came to the path that led through their grove from house to dock. "Let's go out on the dock," Lib said. "I like it out there. No sound, not even the crickets, just the river whispering around the pilings." "All right." They turned left instead of right. As their feet touched the planking, the ship's bell spoke. It clanged 3 times, rapidly, and then twice more, and it kept on ringing. "Oh, damn it to hell!" Randy grabbed her hand, and they started the run for the house, an uphill 1/4 mile in sand and darkness, and after 100 yards, she released his hand and fell behind. By the time he reached the back steps, Randy couldn't climb them. He was wobbling, and his knees had jellied. But before the day, he would not have run that distance at all, and he paused, sobbing, and waited for Lib. The Model A wasn't in the driveway or the garage, and he concluded that Dan hadn't returned, and something frightful had happened to Helen, Peyton, or Bill McGovern. One of the reasons why Randy also is so wobbly is because he hasn't had enough to eat, and so while they are all sustaining themselves on 1,500 calories a day, all of this extra exertion, his body is just weak. He was wrong. It had happened to Dan. Dan was in the dining room, a ruined hulk of man overflowing the captain's chair, arms hanging loose, legs outstretched, shirt blood-soaked, beard blood-matted. Where his right eye should have been, bulged a blue-black bump, large as half an apple. His nose was twisted and enlarged, his left eye only a slit in swollen, discolored flesh. He wrecked the car, Randy thought. He went through the windshield, and the face took the steering wheel. Helen laid a wet dish towel over Dan's eyes, and Peyton's face, white and pinched, stood behind her mother with another towel, and it dripped. Except for Dan's choked breathing, the dripping was for a moment the only sound in the room. Dan spoke. and the words came out loudly, or the words came out slowly and thickly, each an effort of will. "Was that you, Randy, who came in?" "It's me, Dan. Don't try and talk yet." Shock, Randy thought, and probably concussion. He turned to Helen. "We should get him into bed. We have to get him upstairs." "I don't know if he can make it," Helen said. "We could hardly get him this far." Helen's dress and Bill McGovern's arms were blood-stained. "Bill, with your help, I can get him up all right." So, with all his weight on their shoulders, they got Dan upstairs and stretched out on the sleigh bed. Bill said, "I'm going to be sick." He left them. Helen brought clean, wet towels. Dan's body shook and quivered. His skin grew clammy. He was having a chill. And Randy lifted his thick wrist and after a time located the pulse. It was faint, uneven, and rapid. This was shock, all right, and dangerous. Randy said, "Whiskey." Helen said, "I'll handle this, Randy." "No whiskey. Blankets." He respected Helen's judgment. In an emergency such as this, Helen functioned. This was what she was made for. He found extra blankets in the closet. She covered Dan and disappeared. She returned with a glass of fluid and held it to Dan's lips and said, "Drink this. Drink all you can." "What are you giving him?" Randy asked. "Water with salt and soda. Much better than whiskey for shock." Dan drank, gagged, and drank more. "Keep pouring this into him," Helen ordered. "I'm going to go see what's in the medicine cabinet." "Almost nothing," Randy said. "Where's his bag?" "Everything's in there." "They took it in the car." "Who took it?" "The highwaymen." He should have guessed that it hadn't been an accident. Dan was a careful driver, and rarely were two cars on the same road. Traffic was no longer a problem. In his concern for Dan, he did not immediately think of what this loss meant to all of them. Helen found peroxide and bandages. This, with aspirin, was almost all that remained of their medical supply. She worked on Dan's face swiftly and efficiently as a professional nurse. Randy felt nauseated, not at the sight of Dan's injuries, he had seen worse, but in disgust at the beasts who in callous cruelty had dragged down and maimed and destroyed the human dignity of this selfless man. Yet it was nothing new. It had been like this at some point in every civilization and on every continent. They were human jackals for every human disaster. He fixed his fingers, wanting a throat in them. He flexed his fingers, wanting a throat in them, and he walked into the other room. Lib's head lay across her arms on the bar, and she was crying, and when she raised her face, it was oddly twisted, as when a child's face loses form in panic or unexpected pain. She said, "What are you going to do about it, Randy?" His rage was a hard, cold ball in his stomach now, and when he spoke, it was in a monotone voice and the voice of someone else. "I am going to execute them. Let's get with it. Yes, as soon as I find out who." At 11 o'clock, Dan came out of shock, relaxed, and then slept for a few minutes. He awoke announcing he was hungry. He looked no better. He was in pain, but obviously he was out of danger. Randy was dismayed at the thought of Dan in his condition, loading his stomach with cold brim and catfish, orange juice, and remnants of salad, and what he needed, coming out of shock, was hot, nourishing bouillon or broth. On occasion, when Malachi or Caleb discovered a gopher hole, and Hannah Henry converted its inhabitants to soup, or when Ben Franklin successfully stalked a squirrel or rabbit, such food was available, but not on this night. The thought of broth triggered his memory. The iron rations! And ran into his office. He threw open the teak sea chest and began digging. Lib and Helen stood behind him and watched, perplexed. Helen said, "What's going on with you now, Randy?" "Don't give him any food until you see what I've got." He was sure he had tucked that foil carton in the corner closest to the desk. It wasn't there. He wondered whether it was something he had dreamed of. But when he concentrated, it seemed very real. It had been on the day before the day after his talk with Malachi. In the kitchen, he had collected a few nourishing odds and ends, tinned or sealed, and dubbed them iron rations for a desperate time. And now that the time was desperate, he couldn't find them. He found the carton in the fourth corner. He probed. He lifted it out and tore at the foil and exposed it for them to see. I put it away for an emergency and I had forgotten it. Lib whispered, "It's beautiful." She examined and fondled the jars and cans. "There's beef broth in here and lots of other stuff." He gave up the carton. "Give him everything he wants." Dan drank the broth and chewed hard candies. Randy wanted to question him, but Helen stopped it. "Tomorrow," she said, "when he's stronger." Helen and Lib were in the bedroom when Randy stretched out on the living room couch. Graff jumped up and nuzzled him, a bed under Randy's arm, and they slept. Randy awoke with a gunshot echoing in his ears, and Graff whimpered, struggling to be free of his arm. And he heard a second shot, and it was from the double 20, he was sure, and it came from the direction of the Henry's house. He slipped on his shoes and ran down the stairs. Graff followed him. He grabbed the .45 from the hallway table and went through the front door. Now was the time that he wished he had had flashlight batteries. The moon was up now, so it wasn't too difficult running down the path. From the moon's height, he guessed it was 3 or 4 o'clock. Through the trees, he saw a lantern blinking, and he hoped Ben Franklin hadn't shot the shadows. He wasn't prepared for what he saw at the Henry's barn. He saw them standing there in a ring, Malachi with a lantern in one hand, and in the other the ancient single-barreled shotgun that would sometimes shoot. Ben with his gun broken, extracting the empty shells, the Admiral in pajamas, Preacher in a nightshirt, Caleb, his eyes white-rimmed, tentatively poking with his spear at a dark form on the ground. Randy joined the circle and put his hand on Ben Franklin's shoulder, and at first he thought it was a wolf. And then he knew it was the biggest German shepherd that he had ever seen, its tremendous jaws open in a white snarl of death. It wore a collar. Graff, tail whipping, sniffed the dead dog, whined, and retreated. Randy leaned over and examined the brass plate on the collar. Malachi held the lantern closer. "Lindy," Randy read. "Mrs. H. G. Cogswell, Rochester, New York. Hillside, 51379. "That dog come an awfully long way from home," Preacher said. "Probably his owners were visiting down here or on vacation," Randy guessed. "Well," Malachi said, "I can see why we've been missing hens, and how he could take off that pig. He was a mighty big dog, mighty big. I'll get rid of him in the day, Mr. Randy." Walking home, Ben Franklin said nothing, and suddenly he stopped and handed Randy the shotgun and covered his face with his hands and sobbed. Randy squeezed his shoulder. "Take it easy, Ben." Randy thought it was the reaction after strain, excitement, and perhaps terror. "I did exactly what you told me," the boy said. "I heard him coming and I could hardly breathe, and I didn't pull until I knew I couldn't miss him. And when he kicked up, I thought he was getting up, and I let him have the choke barrel. I wouldn't have done it if I had known it was a dog. Randy, I thought it was a wolf." Randy stopped in the path and said, "Look at me, Ben." Ben looked up, tear streaks shining in the moonlight. "It was a wolf," Randy said. It wasn't a dog any longer. In times like these, dogs can turn into wolves. And you did just right, Ben. Here, take back your gun." And the boy took the gun and tucked it under his arm, and they walked on.